Let's turn today to Luke's Gospel, chapter 11 and verse 37. Now when Jesus had spoken, a Pharisee asked him to have lunch with him, and he went in and reclined at table. And when the Pharisee saw it, he was surprised that he had not first ceremonially washed before the meal. But the Lord said to him, Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but inside of you you're full of robbery and wickedness. You foolish ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give that which is within as charity, and then all things are clean for you. We find here that Jesus had no hesitation to go and have a meal, even in the homes of Pharisees. Jesus did not adopt a super spiritual position, which would actually be false spirituality, where he felt he could not even visit a Pharisee. A Pharisee asked him to have lunch, and he went. And at the same time, we see that he didn't become a slave to the Pharisee just because he had been offered a meal. He gave correction where correction was needed. And we find here Jesus speaking some very, very strong words to the Pharisees, even though the one who had invited him was a Pharisee. And it was all triggered off by the Pharisee being surprised that Jesus had not ceremonially washed his hands before eating the meal, like the Pharisees did as a part of their religious tradition to show cleanliness. But the Lord said to him in verse 39, You Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but inside of you you're full of robbery and wickedness. Jesus used the opportunity to point out to the Pharisee that the important thing was not to clean our hands or the outside, and by implication, the cleansing of the outward part of our life was not the primary thing. In other words, freedom from external sin also is not sufficient. He said, You people clean the outside. In other words, your life looks clean on the outside, but inside of you, you're full of robbery and wickedness. Robbery in the sense that you take what doesn't belong to you. For example, if you take the glory that doesn't belong to you but belongs to God, you're a robber. And wickedness means wrong attitudes towards money, towards people, possessive, covetous attitudes, etc. He says you can have all that inside and yet look very pious and holy on the outside. And then he said to the Pharisees, verse 40, You foolish ones, the God who made the outside, didn't he make the inside too? Why is it then we prefer to clean the outside? It's because that is the part of us that men can see. There are two parts to all of our lives. One is that part which God sees, the inside and the outside, particularly the inside, which only God can see. The other is the outside, which both man and God see. And when we live only before the face of men, for the honor of men, we will only clean the outside because that's the only part that man can see. It's like a building. The foundation is the part which men cannot see. The superstructure is the part men can see. And so in our lives too. And Jesus always emphasized the importance of the foundation, the part which can't be seen. The same way here. That part which can't be seen, after all, even if a cup is dirty on the outside, provided the inside is clean, we can still drink from it. But if the outside is clean and the inside is filthy, we can't drink from it. But here Jesus said, didn't he make the inside and the outside? And if you are really seeking to live before God's face, then you will concentrate on the inside and the outside. But he said, begin with the inside. And when you clean the inside, everything will be clean. And he said, when you think of giving, don't just be occupied with giving tithe on the outside, but give that which is within as charity. In other words, let your charity begin not with the few coins you give to the poor, to your poor brothers, but from within with a loving attitude. That requires me having to give something of myself within, my ego, my prestige, my rights, my reputation, so many things, my convenience perhaps, to give that up as charity. And if my inner attitude towards people changes, then all things will be clean to me. Whether I wash my hands or not, it'll be clean. But he said in verse 42, woe to you Pharisees, for you don't do that. You concentrate on paying tithe of mint and rue and every kind of garden herb. In other words, they're very exact in taking 1/10 of everything that grew in their gardens and giving it to God. And yet they disregarded more important things than garden herbs, that God didn't want garden herbs. He wanted more important things than that, like righteousness and the love of God. He says, if you don't have love in your heart towards your neighbor who is in need, what's the use giving 1/10 of your garden herbs to God? That's ritualism. And this ritualistic Phariseeism is something that all of us are constantly in danger of concentrating on the externals, concentrating on the letter of God's commandments instead of the spirit. When you disregard righteousness and the love of God, and you concentrate on external ritualistic detail, you become a Pharisee. But the Lord said, these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. He says that it doesn't mean that you should neglect the external part of your life. It doesn't mean that obedience in the little things like paying your tithe. In Old Testament times, tithe was important. Not today, because today the command is, God loves a cheerful giver. Let everyone give as he has purposed in his heart. But in the Old Testament, the tithe was a command, and you couldn't ignore it. You couldn't neglect it. It was part of the law. So Jesus didn't say that they should neglect it. He said, without neglecting that, you should have concentrated on what God considers to be primary, and that is righteousness or justice, being righteous towards others and loving. Another area, he said, you Pharisees, you love the front seats in the synagogues and the respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Just imagine Jesus being invited to a meal by a Pharisee and starting out the sermon, hitting out at all the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, for their concentration on the external part of their lives, and for loving the front seats and respectful greetings, and for calling them concealed tombs. Verse 44, he says, woe unto you. Woe is the opposite of blessing. It's like a curse. Imagine cursing people who have invited you for a meal. Jesus was faithful to the truth. He didn't hate the Pharisees. He certainly didn't hate the Pharisee who invited him for a meal that day. But he loved them so much that he was concerned about their eternal welfare. And that's why he spoke the truth to them. He was a prophet. It's rare to find prophets like that today, who are so concerned about the eternal welfare of those they speak to, that they will speak the truth and not be bribed into a silence by a meal. Woe to you Pharisees, he says, for you love the front seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, which there's nothing wrong in being greeted. There's nothing wrong in taking a particular seat if that's the seat where you're meant to take, but there's everything wrong in loving it. When you love the front seat, because that sort of puts you in a respectful place in the eyes of others in the meeting, in the church meeting hall, and you love the respectful greetings that other people give you, then there is something seriously wrong. Because then we have begun to seek the honor of men. And that is idolatry. Woe unto you, he said, for you're like concealed tombs, and the people who walk over them are unaware of it. In other words, they were like people who had spiritual death within them, but people who came in touch with them couldn't recognize that. They looked very beautiful on the outside, marble, tombstones, but underneath full of dead men's bones. And the people who come near it don't realize what corruption lies within. We see here that Jesus hit out at the Pharisees more than he hit out at any other group during his public ministry. We find him forgiving the woman caught in adultery. We find him forgiving the thief and the murderer who hung with him on the cross. If we consider murder and adultery as two of the greatest crimes the world considers as great, then we see how Jesus forgave murderers, criminals, adulterous women, because of one reason: they acknowledged their need. They didn't pretend. The woman caught in adultery didn't pretend that she was not an adulteress. Out of the two thieves, the one who never admitted his need never got forgiven and went to hell. But the other one, who was equally a criminal, equally guilty, went straight into paradise because of only one reason: at the last minute he acknowledged his need and asked for mercy. This is the way of salvation. And this is why Jesus couldn't forgive the Pharisees, because there was no acknowledgement of their need. There was hypocrisy. There was religious pretense. And it's exactly the same today. Jesus hates and detests those with any type of religious pretense who sit in our churches. He can forgive the adulteress and the murderer. But those who have an outward veneer of religiosity, who are keeping the commandments externally, but not having mercy and love and righteousness, he denounces even today.